Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. A warm welcome to everyone. And this is Nithin Sridhar, Chief Curator of Advaita Academy. And today we have a special guest, Sri Akilesh Ayyar ji, joining from Brooklyn, US. So let me just begin with a short prayer. Sada Shiva Samarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. To just give a brief bio, Akilesh Ayyar ji is a spiritual mentor and writer who has been engaged in Advaita Vedanta for the last 20 years. He specializes in a modern interpretation, a practical interpretation of Sri Ramana Maharshi's, self-inquiry and other teachings as a path to truth and enlightenment. He has written two books on self-realization, the most recent of which is Spiritual Dialogues with Akilesh, Q&A on Liberation and Truth. He has a very wide range of qualifications, including as a graduate degrees from uh, Carnegie Mellon University, City University of New York, and Harvard Law School. And he has taught and presented at Science and Non-Duality and many other places. He maintains a website. If you want to know more about his work, you should visit his website, the siftingtothetruth.com. He guides seekers on a one-to-one basis as well, and occasionally through workshops. Very warm welcome to you, Akilesh. Thank you for joining us today.
Namaste. Thank you so much, Nithin, for having me and for to Advaita Academy for hosting our conversation.
So let me straight away jump and open up with the question that we ask in this question, and this question to all of our guests who invite us. And this conversation has been designed in a way to inspire everyone by sharing the personal journeys of all of us seekers, basically. So tell us about your life journey and especially your introduction to Vedanta and your journey in Vedanta since the last 20 years.
Okay, so yeah, long complicated path actually, but I'll try to simplify it. So the narrative I usually tell is that in high school I became fairly depressed, feeling that life was pointless, and probably it had to do with my own personal issues at the time. And it wasn't just an existential thing, but it was an existential thing as well. Why are we here? What is the reason for all the suffering? And there's an old saying in the East, not just I think in India, but across many cultures, that when the student is ready, the teacher will come. And the truth is that is in fact how it happened for me, because in that year in high school, our family hosted a Swami Bodhananda Saraswati. And so he happened to come to our house. And, I'd had interactions with other Hindu figures in the past, asking them questions, but I found that most of them couldn't converse with me, couldn't give answers, couldn't answer doubts. And he was willing and able to have deep conversations. And so we started talking about Advaita, and, I peppered him with question after question after question. And it was very, it was informal. It was an informal arrangement, but, he would come to our house for a couple of weeks every year. And, I got to know Advaita over several years that way, talking with him. Now that was for a few years. And then I thought, oh, now I understand Advaita. But actually it was just the beginning of my journey, really, because as soon as I tried to apply these principles, what I thought were the principles of Advaita and what they meant, I ran into these obstacles. And there are many kinds of obstacles, but I think the primary obstacles I ran into were my own lack of motivation to concentrate and to do what needed to be done in terms of keeping my mind a certain way. And so I kind of had to then sort of branch off on my own and figure out, well, why was it that I wasn't motivated to do what I thought was obviously going to bring me peace and truth? And so that took me, I don't know, the next 10, 12 years of sort of searching my own personal life. And it took me through a lot of different areas, but I'll sort of summarize that. Basically, I think what really helped me was delving into my own psyche. I did that through a number of modalities. Kind of the one I recommend the most right now to a lot of people, and which helped me a lot for several years, was something called psychoanalysis, which is a kind of therapy, but also a lot of artistic expression, and just looking into my own desires, really, and understanding them better. This was a process. So as much as I would have liked to just shortcut it and go directly to, being, a person of perfect concentration, it turned out that I couldn't shortcut it. I had to engage with my desires and become more honest about what I wanted and explore myself. And only when I did that over a period of 10 or 12 years was my ability to concentrate on the spiritual unlocked, And so, so it's a complicated terrain exactly how that happened, but that's what happened. So another very important influence during this time, it just goes to show you how psychology and one's the state of one's mind affects spiritual understanding. Around say 2003 or so, I already had been familiar with Advaita for several years. That's probably when I came across Ramana Maharshi. And so when I came across him at first, I already knew he was profound. I got that sense immediately, but I found I couldn't really understand him. I knew he was important, but I didn't fully get him. And so, over the next, again, 10, 12 years, 15 years even, he and Advaita generally were always part of the background of my life. It's never that I ever fully left it. But when I kind of revisited Ramana Maharshi a decade later, in sort of teaching a scriptural class to some friends, I suddenly found that I had a lot more clarity about what he meant. And I think it was because of the personal development and investigation of myself that I'd engaged in over time. So, so there's an interplay, I guess, is what I found in my own life between the psychological and the spiritual, and they go back and forth. And so where there are resistances to pursuing the spiritual, I believe that usually they're found in the psychological. So, oh yeah, so anyway, so I came back to Ramana Maharishi, and I got a lot more clarity about what he meant, and then I fell into a period of quite intense practice for about a year or so, and then at a certain point, for lack of a better word, and this I think can become very misleading, but basically, there's a certain level of clarity that became established, and then I started teaching.
Wonderful. That is a very inspirational and encouraging account indeed. The you mentioned in while you're just narrating, you mentioned about your difficulties and desire and lack of motivation, and I think these are the issues that all seekers face, especially in their initial part of the journey. And I remember, I think Adi Shankaracharya compares this mind to a monkey uh, in his Shivananda Lahari. So I think the controlling desires is one of the greatest difficulties. So I think in your lectures and all, you also speak about something called science of desire, and you teach about how to, kind of control them or bring them and restrain them. Can you share more about this?
So I'm glad you brought this up, Nithin. So actually, I usually prefer not to think about it as controlling desire, but rather that, you know, uh, at every moment we are kind of faced with um, uh, our current desire situation, and it's not like you can really control it. Rather, what we can do about it is become more honest about it. There's a shloka in the Gita, which unfortunately I'm unfortunately not someone well versed enough in Sanskrit to be able to quote the actual Sanskrit to you, but the essence of it is something like, um, those who are basically sitting and meditating, but they actually have the desire for various things in their mind, they're hypocritical, because they're not pursuing what they actually honestly want. So that's actually my approach to it, that it's not about violently controlling desire. It's about becoming more honest about what we actually want. In the process of becoming more honest about what we actually want, then things can move, because so much of what we want is often we're ashamed of. We don't want to think about it. We think of ourselves as we would like to be rather than as we actually are. And so, and that kind of stops us in our tracks because we want to sort of tyrannically control ourselves, but that's not the way things work. We are in fact, as it says at the end of the Gita, we are pieces on a machine whirled by the Lord. So what we can do is we can turn the pages of the book of ourselves in order. That's what we can do wherever we are now, to recognize where it is we are now, what it is that we are feeling, what it is that we are desiring, not what we would like to be, not what we would wish we were, but where we actually are. Because that emotional reality, once we recognize it, once we can listen to the different voices in ourselves, there are kind of different, we're not just one single voice. We are a multiplicity of voices within us, our psyche. We can listen to those. Then there's a chance that we can take care of our needs in a more peaceful, sattvic kind of way. We can learn to synthesize, but it's only by listening to ourselves and admitting into our consciousness perhaps desires that we wish we didn't have, but that came from our upbringing, that came from our past karma of various kinds. So that's the way I view it, right? It's not about this kind of forceful control. It is about opening up and recognizing and becoming more and more honest, and becoming honest in our pursuit, of what we want. And that moves things in that way. As we become more honest, we integrate ourselves, and that's what allows us to move forward. And that's what allows us to move forward towards the spiritual as well. That, because, we're spending so much time fighting ourselves, in so many different aspects, that robs us of our energy, and so it's not about fighting ourselves. It's about, it's about becoming, all I can say is about becoming more honest about what we want. So, you talk about the science of desire. Yeah. So that's sort of, a concept that I put in some of my books and blog posts where, I think there is a way of kind of systematically clarifying what it is we want through a process of feeling our emotions, expressing our emotions, perhaps in words or perhaps in other artistic medium, if we enjoy drawing or painting, expressing our emotions, and seeing how we react to different situations. Like, we may think we want something, but then, if we actually test it out, we pursue it a little bit, we don't actually want that. Maybe we thought we wanted it because someone told us we want that, or we think we should want that, but we don't. Oh, you should want to go to the temple, whatever it is. We have all these shoulds in our mind, right? And they cloud us, and they kind of prevent us from seeing what's actually there, which is very, very important. So I recommend this process of kind of really engaging with our emotions and artistic expression, and testing our desires out. Because the reality is, as much as we would like to be able to control what we want, we cannot control what we want. We can only acknowledge what we want. In the process of acknowledgement, that moves us forward. That allows us to see more things about ourselves, see more things about the world. We have to review our emotional terrain as it's kind of in a way given to us. It's not like it's not for us to just say, I want to want something else. That's not how it works. So, but I mean, so I've recommended that, but the reality is, I often find now in my work with my students and so on that the truth is, I often find that psychotherapy is a better frontline suggestion, because the reality is it's, so much of what we want, you know, again, it's concealed from ourselves by ourselves. We live in a kind of state of, we don't want to really see ourselves as we are. So it can be so helpful to have a therapist, somebody else who can together with us compassionately open up those areas. It's very hard to do surgery on yourself, so so my kind of first line recommendation now is psychoanalysis, which by the way is, again, it's a very specific kind of therapy. It's not just any therapy, but frankly, even any therapy would probably be better than nothing for most people. But yeah, so that I usually find now is the way that I recommend that people open up their desire, open up their honesty about the desire. Resistances, why is it you have resistances? Because of unacknowledged emotional conflict, basically.
I believe you conduct one-on-one sessions with guiding seekers and using psychotherapy, right? Can you share more about what you do in these sessions and
Yes.
how you guide?
So I tend to work with serious seekers who are generally already fairly motivated. Advaita Vedanta has a traditional set of qualifications for seekers. I think Ramana Maharshi once said, kind of tongue in cheek, oh, probably nobody has ever met these qualifications in the history of the world, because there's so many qualifications. You need to have, discrimination and a distaste for worldly life and so many different kinds of control of your mind. I don't think that all of those qualifications are possible to have for someone who is still a seeker, usually. But people can have them in various degrees, So I typically work with people who are, who are already fairly motivated. And what I do with them is I walk them through my interpretation and understanding of Ramana Maharishi's techniques, basically. And his techniques are, after all, the distillation of the wisdom of Advaita. And they basically fall into two categories, self-inquiry and surrender. And I recommend that seekers do these as close to at every waking moment as possible. And so I accompany them on their journeys in these sessions, meeting with them on a regular basis to see how that practice has gone for them, what the obstacles are that arise for them, what are their understandings of the practice, because they usually have questions, they usually have problems applying it, problems understanding it, and then sort of trying to show them how in the process of self-inquiry and surrender, something more is being pointed to. That's the unspeakable core truth of Vedanta, the Tattvamasi. That is something which can ultimately only be pointed to, cannot be actually precisely said. So I kind of help them practice, provide motivation, answer their questions, refine their technique, and try to push them towards that recognition of that truth.
That's a very fascinating to me. As I'm hearing it, sounds very fascinating. I want to come back to this question you mentioned about artistic expressions to understand emotions. I think in one of your writings you also write about self-realization and art. So can you elaborate more on this bit? How to see the notion of self-knowledge through art?
Yeah, I mean, so mostly when I think about artistic expression, I mean it as a way of clarifying the emotional and psychological landscape. I think, of course, art can represent and does represent in our, great scriptures and great Puranas. It can represent some of the elements of the ultimate truth. It can show it metaphorically. Um, and I think fundamentally, you know, the beauty of art, again, Ramana Maharshi said this wonderfully, the beauty of art is ultimately nothing other than the beauty of the self. The what he called Brahma rasa, the taste of Brahman, basically, is nothing other than the aesthetic bliss of art. The representation of our individual perspective, if you do it accurately, is in a sense going to be accurately showing something of the beauty of the self, basically. But that said, fundamentally, so I think art is basically operating mostly on the psychological plane, and it can be helpful for seekers to help clarify that part of themselves so that they can have a quieter mind, a more concentrated mind, a more motivated mind to pursue inquiry or surrender.
What you say actually reminds me of M. Hirana's understanding of, I don't know whether you know him or not. He was a philosopher. He has written on all aspects of Indian philosophy. So when he writes on art and aesthetic experience, he calls something called as art contemplation, and he says it's very similar to the art aesthetic experience is very similar to the moksha or the ultimate, the knowledge of Brahman. Only the difference is in the degree of the experience. One is temporary, the other is permanent. So what you said just
Yeah,
reminded
that's
me of
beautifully
that.
said. Yeah.
So you said Swami Bodhananda Saraswati had a huge influence on you, early influence on you in Vedanta, and later Ramana Maharshi. So did you study the text of Advaita Vedanta under a teacher, or it was more of a self study, or
No, it was mostly a self-study. So yeah, I mean, mainly with Swamiji, it was mainly asking questions, and I must have read at least at some point, early on the Gita, but I never formally studied the scriptures. I've read many of them on my own over the years, but no formal study per se under Swamiji or anybody else.
You mentioned that two paths that Ramana Maharshi ji speaks about to seekers are self-inquiry and surrender, and you also focus on these techniques. So, can you share more about this, especially on how Ramana Maharshi explains this? And are they two really exclusively distinct paths, or are they interrelated, interlinked to each other? Basically, two different ways of going about the same.
Yes. So yes. So I think Ramana Maharshi has done such an astounding genius job of distilling Advaita into just these extremely simple, beautiful techniques, and they absolutely are interrelated, very much interrelated. In fact, I would say that they're really two angles on exactly the same process. And what is that process? That process is basically the process of looking inward, turning the gaze away from manifestation and towards something else. And that is the basic heart of the Advaita, is there is something beyond thought. Everything is covered with thought, but there is something in a way that's not, in some sense. And so this something else is right here all the time, but it goes unnoticed because it's covered by our usual egoic way of looking at things. And so, you know, um, there's a machine essentially of identity, desire, and fear that keeps the egoic illusion, which is to say, the sense that I'm a doing, experiencing person, that keeps that running, and it makes it feel as if it's so real. And so the task of the spiritual seeker is throw sand in the gears of that machine. How? By turning the attention inward, by turning it away from the usual mental habits of desire and fear and identity. And self-inquiry and surrender are the ways to do that. And they are basically, as I say, the same way, just from slightly different angles. So self-inquiry, as I interpret Maharishi, is that there's basically a very simple, common sense, everyday sense of I amness. Like, I'm here right now. I'm having this conversation with you. That kind of sense of I am. Inquiry says, okay, turn your attention towards that. But there's a certain rule that goes with it. The rule is, when you've attempted to turn your attention towards that, notice where your attention actually goes. For example, a lot of people might say, oh, you know, I've turned my attention towards some place in my head because it feels like that's where the I seems to be coming from. It seems to be coming from my head. Some people might say, right? The rule of self-inquiry is that which you are aware of cannot be the actual I, because the I seems to be looking out at the world, looking out at the thoughts, looking out at the feelings. If there weren't a distance between you and the object of experience, you couldn't experience it. So what we're trying to do with inquiry is we have this common sense, extremely intimate, obvious sense of I-ness, and we're trying to locate it. We're trying to grasp it. So turn your attention towards it, but then as you turn your attention towards it, you find, oh, well, it's in my head. Okay, well, once you notice that you think it's in your head, then you realize this idea of it being in your head is just itself an object of experience. It's not the actual I. So who's aware of this head feeling, right? You can go that way, right? And then you're looking for it somewhere else, and it feels like, oh, it's all around me somewhere. All around me somewhere, for example, would be a thought. That's a thought. So that all around me somewhere cannot also be the I. So what is aware of that, right? And on it goes. And so what we're looking for is the continuous hunting, chasing the I. Because the reality is when you do this for a while, you'll quickly see it's actually very, very difficult to find where this I is, actually. You know, it seems so obvious, but when you actually try to turn your attention towards it, what you end up with is a series of objects, not the I, but a series of objects of experience. So to keep your mind relentlessly focused on chasing the I, chasing and chasing and chasing, and turning all the thoughts that you would normally have about anything else, they're all now reflecting the I, because you know anything you're experiencing, you experience that, but you also experience the fact that you experience it. So everything becomes an opportunity to turn towards, to attempt to turn towards the I, because it will not be immediately successful for almost everybody. So because in a sense, you know, what you think is the I is not the I. That's the issue. You see, there's an illusion at work. So self-inquiry is targeting the weak point of this illusion, which is the sense of the I, because the sense of the I is the I plus an association with some object of experience. The true I is not sensed as an I. So to cut through the way that association works, you know, it's sort of like light with, you know, it's like a light which is shining through, you know, stained glass or something like that, you know? So you have to work your way attention through the objects with which the I is associated, and then it will become clear to you the actual nature of the I, which is not what you thought it was. Not what you thought it was. So inquiry is slicing through all these thoughts. What you're doing is you are in effect having to turn your attention going inward, away from all the objects of thought, hunting the I. And one does this at all times, or as close as possible to at all times, you know, and everything else goes by the wayside, ideally. Now, it's difficult in practice to do this because seekers are attached. Seekers are attached to their lives. That's the problem. So self-inquiry is in direct conflict with people's attachment to their sense of themselves. But inquiry is trying to slice through that. And inquiry works by you know, both surrender and inquiry generate peace, basically, in the process, right? As you do it, you generate concentration. Concentration generates peace. Peace provides extra motivation, more concentration, more peace. And that's how the vasanas and the mental tendencies are destroyed through that process. So that's inquiry. So that's my interpretation of Maharishi's inquiry. That's how I would recommend going about it. This continuous process of inward looking towards the I, hunting it, hunting it, hunting it. Now, surrender, I explain a bit differently. Again, my interpretation of Maharishi. Surrender, I explain as ignore all thought and relax. Just ignore all thought and relax at all times. Just keep ignoring all thought except the thought of surrender itself. Ignore all thought except the thought of surrender itself and relax. So you maintain this one thought of what? Of surrender. Now, surrender could be You could view it as a bhakti kind of thing, surrender to the Supreme, or you can just view it as surrender, period. But either way, the idea is take your attention continuously away from all the objects of experience. Keep moving it back. It's not a one and done thing. You have to continuously withdraw your attention from the objects of all experience and relax, meaning you're not, what do we mean by relax? We mean not that you necessarily have to feel relaxed. Relaxation is not about feeling relaxed. It's about not exerting voluntary effort. So the analogy I often give my students about surrender is, imagine there's a television in the corner of the room. On that television is playing all the thoughts. You do not have to turn the television off. You do not have to change the channel. You do not have to notice every single image on the TV. You merely have to ignore the TV, treating it as irrelevant. That's the practice of surrender. So all you do is ignore the TV and relax. That's it. That is, in fact, your actual nature. You know, the funny thing is, right, surrender is we are doing deliberately and effortfully something which is actually just our simple nature. The nature of the self is non-doing, effortlessness. So we are mimicking that actually. And just like with inquiry, we're going to run into resistances to it, which then have to be worked through continuous persistence. But if you notice, right, speaking of the interrelationship between the two, in inquiry, you're hunting the I, and in the process, you're ignoring thought. That's what you're doing. You have to be. You have to continuously find what isn't thought. In surrender, you are ignoring thought and relaxing. But then where is your attention going? It's going, you're backing the attention into what else? The I. So they are, in fact, the same process. They're just viewed slightly differently. Self-inquiry feels more active. It's more of a riddle for people who are attracted to that idea of solving this inscrutable riddle, you know, their minds are attracted by that. Others really enjoy the idea of just relaxing. And so surrender appeals. The reality is both involve concentration, and both are processes of what I would call progressive discernment, meaning more and more and more you discover subtler and subtler and subtler thoughts and attachments, and you separate your attention from them. Basically, in both processes, this is the case. And you know, and they're complementary because one can switch between them. They are perfectly compatible. You can go between them. But these are, in my opinion, you know, the supreme processes of the spiritual search, and they embody the heart of Advaita.
Wonderful. That is such a very elaborate and very illustrative account, and it's simply wonderful. I mean, as I was listening to you, two thoughts came to my mind. Your description of self-inquiry is that is, in traditional Vedantic terms is nididhyasana, basically wherein the contemplation of Mahavakyas like Aham Brahmasmi, which is basically self-inquiry. And the surrender reminded me of Sri Gaudapadacharya's Asparsha Yoga, which he mentions in Mandukya Upanishad. I did a paper, I think, last year or a year ago on this, and you basically mentioned the same thing that, you know, a surrender means non-attachment, non-contact, just ignore, right? Yeah. So,
Yes.
in this context, I have a question. Today, post Ramana Maharshi, lot of scholars, a lot of practitioners have been influenced by Ramana Maharshi. So there is a position which has come up in the traditional Vedantic scheme. While this Nididhyasana, Asparsha Yoga, everything, every process is already given. Uh, it is said that one cannot practice them successfully unless one has purity of mind, at least. To the basic minimum is the purity of mind. As long as we are attached to, we have this, you know, the what is called arishat vargas, kama, krodha, lobha, moha, the jealousy and lust and all those things in the mind. It is almost impossible to practice this, or at least it would not be fruitful practice. So in the traditional scheme, in the traditional Vedantic scheme, so before seeker kind of takes up this practice, or you know, he is advised to practice, say, swadharma, karma yoga, and bhakti yoga. which helps him to gain this purity of mind. But now today we see, for the lack of better word, uh, some call this neo-Advaita. I am not sure how accurate this description is, but there is a school of thought which says that all this bhakti, karma, and all these preparatory exercises are not at all needed. One can directly plunge into the self-inquiry and become successful. So, what are your thoughts on this?
So it's very interesting. So first of all, let me just say about neo-Advaita. So I think people have different understandings of what neo-Advaita is. My understanding of neo-Advaita, and I would definitely not class myself as a neo-Advaitan, is that they are those who say they don't even advise the self-inquiry or surrender practice that I have mentioned, because I very clearly advise my students to practice, like you said, nididhyasana. It is an effortful practice until the effort is taken from you, but it is a practice. And some of the neo-Advaitans, as far as I understand it, basically say there's nothing to be done. There's nothing to be done. You're already that. There's nothing to be done. There's nothing to be done. And I find that misleading and unhelpful, because though it may be true in some very, very at the deepest levels that yes, in fact, nothing is to be done, but I don't find that helpful for seekers. So I would definitely not agree with that. Now, that said, in terms of the preparation you're talking about, so I do think a certain degree of purity is in fact required. That's like when I talk about, for example, I have a different conception of how to get to that purity, right? I'm talking about therapy and things like that. I think that in a way is the working through of that purity. Now, of course, I do recommend karma yoga sometimes, some of my students as well, bhakti as well, depends. But I will say that my own feeling is if someone is a seeker and wants to jump to inquiry or surrender, then great. And I think, and I would encourage them to do that. And because I think life is short, and go directly to the source. I think that's how Maharishi would talk about it too, ultimately, right? Just be, you can access it. If you want it, it's yours, grab it. And I encourage that. That said, what happens is that those who are unqualified to do that will notice it themselves in time. So, they won't be able to. And they won't be able to have the motivation. They won't be able to have the consistency. They'll just keep resisting and resisting and resisting. And then it comes to me to basically advise them that, maybe try this different route. Try karma yoga, try therapy, try something else. You're not ready for this, in the sense of you're incapable. You yourself don't want to do it, which is what it comes to. That's really what it is, right? The desire, the mumukshutva, which is the most important of all the qualifications, the intense desire for liberation, it's not sufficiently strong, right? Which is why I say, right? So that's why people have to kind of be where they will be forced to go where they ultimately are. They will not be able to do these ultimate practices if they are not qualified. But how do you know whether someone's qualified? So I encourage people, if they want to, if they have the desire, if they seem to have the desire to want to jump to the ultimate truth, great. Because I will say that while a certain degree of mental purity is required to practice these practices, it's only a certain degree. Surrender and inquiry also have a purifying effect on the mind, a very powerful purifying effect. They themselves are the vasana destroyers par excellence, So if you have sufficient purity to use those even a little bit, they will draw you further in. They will act to give you mental purity in time. But there are those who are unable to do that. And so for them, karma or other practices may be recommended, basically. Therapy, whatever it is, it depends on the person. But I favor allowing people who think they want the self to go directly. Why not? Try it, please.
Wonderful, Akilesh. Viewers, if you have any questions, now is the time to ask. Please put your questions in Q&A box, and I will take it one by one. Um, One of the I have read Ramana Maharshi to some extent, and he stayed a large part of his life in Arunachala, and I think in one of his writings he says, while Shiva lives in Kailasha, Arunachala is Shiva himself. So I know a lot of my friends, a lot of people I know are hugely attracted to Arunachala. They do the Girivalam and they and they also connect, self-identify and in a sense identify Ramana Maharshi with Arunachala, so on and so forth. So have you, in your course of study of Ramana Maharshi, in your following his teachings, at a personal level, at a personal spiritual level, have you had some kind of attraction to Arunachala as well? Have you visited it? Have you done Girivallam or something?
I haven't actually, to be honest. I have not been to Arunachala or Tiruvannamalai or any of those places. And I mean, if I was in the area, maybe I would go. And also just to sort of see the community of seekers that is around there, that would be interesting. But ultimately, I have to say, I think that Maharishi would be the first to say that, um, you know, he's actually not located in any particular place, and so uh, I I feel like, Maharishi is a self. So, and the self is beyond location. So not to say that holy places and temples are not wonderful, beautiful places. They are, and they, and they may very well help seekers calm their minds, basically. But I haven't felt a particular extremely strong urge, to be honest. I think I may go if it's convenient and if it's in my uh, if um if that's in the cards for me, basically. Yeah, yeah.
Um, I wanted to ask, discuss about your something about your books as well. I think two of your very well-known books are "How to Find What Is Not Lost," and the recent one is that Spiritual Dialogues with Akilesh, right? So,
Yes.
can you share about these books and what kind of topics you discuss in them, and how it is, to which audience is it addressed, and how it would be useful?
Sure. So, I mean, both are addressed to seekers. I think the second book, the dialogue book, is perhaps uh slightly more advanced in some sense because it kind of plunges right in without giving much in the way of introduction. But the first book, How to Find What Isn't Lost, is trying to give my very, very big picture overview of the spiritual search. And sort of it starts with um, arguments about why it is we would even believe that there is something called enlightenment. What are some of the arguments against common day scientific materialism, which would usually close people off to the possibility of some kind of knowledge beyond the mind, um, and then various metaphors for what the relationship might be between the mind and the self. But people wonder about these kinds of things, and sort of give them some introductory ideas like that, like, oh, like, is it like a is it, is Maya like a movie? Is it like a dream? Is it like being a character in a novel? Right? Various things like that might give some people some idea of what's being hinted at or pointed at in Advaita. And then sort of a middle section deals with what we talked about a little bit earlier, this, what I call the science of desire, and this idea of artistic expression as a way to explore our emotions. I mean, I put that in there because I found it very useful in my own personal quest as a seeker to sort of clarify certain things for myself. But as I say now, I kind of recommend analysis or something similar as a first line recommendation for most people now, because I think artistic expression is still very useful, um, but the unconscious is just much easier to open up with another person. So that's the middle section of that book. And then the last section deals with surrender and self-inquiry more directly. It gives specific instructions, which over time, I mean, that was written, a few years ago. And I feel like I've elaborated those instructions um, over my blog posts and my YouTube channel. I put a lot of videos out in surrender and self-inquiry. So I've elaborated those instructions, but the fundamentals remain exactly the same. So that's that first book. The second book came out of many, many questions that people have asked me, mostly online, about numerous spiritual topics, all kinds of things like, to give a random assortment, there's a group of people online who wonder about whether psychedelic drugs can be useful in the spiritual search. There are people who want to know you know, how it is that one, you know, some of the many of the nuances of inquiry. People want to know about, you know, what my personal experience is of quote unquote enlightenment. There are people who want to know about, you know, all kinds of other things that relate to uh, various experiences they have had. You know, is this experience, is this the self? Is that the self? Right? People have all kinds of interesting cosmic, mystical experiences. Right? What is that like? What's the meaning of this? Right? So all kinds of like miscellaneous questions like this, you know, collected over some time. I categorize it into different areas, but that's basically what that second book is, and so it covers many topics.
What other books have you written?
Well, so those are the two books that those are the only two books I've written on my own. You know, earlier on, about 10 years before that, I co-wrote a book with Swami Vivekananda Saraswati, and that was me as a seeker and as a question asker, and he was answering questions. So that was a book called Irreverent Spiritual Questions. But yeah, but I mean, my sort of take on the spiritual search has changed a lot in that time. So mainly,
All these books are available on Amazon, I believe.
they're all available on Amazon. That's right. Yes.
Great, great, wonderful. Viewers, if anybody is interested, I would definitely suggest all these books to check them out. We are coming to almost a conclusion of our session, so I just wanted to ask any final word of advice you have for seekers, especially those who are new to Vedanta, and any other books other than your own books. I mean, any other books that you recommend for beginners.
Yeah. So, you know, my main advice would be if people have a strong desire for liberation, to plunge right in, right, and grasp it, because in a way it's so beautifully simple, right? The actual something like surrender is so extremely simple. Literally just ignore everything and relax. You know, all the complexities arise only from the resistances to that process. So I kind of want to encourage people to say, you know, if you want the self is there to be had immediately, right? You don't need decades of study of different scriptures, okay? One scripture is sufficient. You know, you can pick one and that's enough, and practice, you know. It is about the looking inward at all times. That is where the source of the peace is. Ultimately, all the scriptures can do, all external teachers can do, is to inspire and motivate you to look inward. That looking inward is your process. You can do that, and it's not something which has to be some far away, you know, Himalayan mountain peak, you know, after 35 years or whatever it is. Today, if you want, you can have it. The self is yours. The self is always yours, in fact. So that's one thing I want to encourage seekers to not view themselves as, you know, as you know, some far away distant thing. You know, that's what the self is. No, the self is here right now, and it's yours right now if you are willing to let go. That's basically all it is. Your desire to control the outcome of things is what is keeping you bound. And so if you can let go, then the self is yours. In terms of what I would recommend as far as books go, you know, a few scriptures have been extremely valuable to me. Of course, the Bhagavad Gita, I would say the Yoga Vasishta. I think the Mandukya Upanishad is extraordinary. You know, of course, Shankara's works are amazing. I like Upadesha Sastri. But any of those is amazing. There are several other smaller scriptures that are also beautiful. Ashtavakra Gita is beautiful. You know, so many fascinating ones, but really, you don't need many. I recommend any of those. I recommend, of course, Bhagavan Ramana Maharshi's works. Among those, I actually recommend the talks of Ramana Maharshi, frankly, above all, because when people have complaints about the translations, they say, oh, talks can be misleading, but I disagree. I think the talks are beautiful because it's like having satsang with Maharishi. And you know, there's something that comes through in between the lines that is quite beautiful. So I recommend talks with Maharishi. I recommend, I mean, if you want his sort of authoritative statement, in my opinion, of on many different topics, Guru Vachka Kovai is, you know, his authoritative statement, I think. Any of his works are beautiful, of course, but I would recommend probably Talks of the Ramana Maharshi as extraordinary. If you read, for example, the Bhagavad Gita or the Yoga Vasishta, and then Talks of the Ramana Maharshi, and you practice surrender or self-inquiry at every waking moment, and then you see where your resistances are to that practice, and you try to discern what's going on there, right? And either explore that psychologically, or else just notice that those are the resistances. Just even you're noticing those are the resistances will itself soften them. And if you simply persist, that there's an inner guru who will guide seekers. That is the only important guru, is the inner guru. The inner guru will guide sincere seekers to truth without a doubt. So don't be afraid. I would say pursue it if you want the self. Life is short. Go for it immediately.
Thank you, Akhilesh, for that wonderful final message. And I'm sure the viewers of this show has hugely benefited from your perspective, especially about self-inquiry, about surrender, and how we do not need to wait for some other time to begin the journey. So, the reaching the destination, it's not in our hands now, but we can always begin the journey here and now. And thank you again on behalf of entire Advaita Academy and all our viewers. I thank you for agreeing to come on our show and sharing your thoughts.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you all so much.
Viewers, with this we come to a conclusion of yet another weekend conversations. Tomorrow morning we have a talk by Manjushri Hegde on Vaisheshika Darshana at 11 a.m. And tomorrow evening at 6 p.m., we have another weekend conversation with Sri Prashant Parekh. Do tune in, do register on our website. We'll see you tomorrow. Shri Guru Bhyo Namaha.